All right, well, welcome back to Begin with the Basics. Last week we went over day 2 and 3. We did 2 days at once. It was a little long, but I think it went well. Today we're going to be going over day 4. And again, I'm taking my time on these days because there's actually a lot there. And when we look at creation, there's already a narrative there that a lot of people are looking at. Evolution, billions of years. And I want to take a look at this and go through this in a well-ordered fashion to make sure that we're dealing with those ideas and talking about the biblical perspective and not coming to it with the idea of these billions of years or coming to Genesis 1 and kind of just brushing it off and saying, yeah, that's what the Bible says, but, it has problems. I want to deal with these problems. So that's why I'm taking my time on this. We're just going to get through day 4 today. As I was going through it, there's a lot here. And again, dealing with some of the problems, because we talk about sun, moons, and stars, and, there are automatically, if we're thinking creation versus, Big Bang, there's a lot of things that kind of pop into our heads. So, yeah, day 4 is our plan for today. Next week, hopefully, we'll get through the rest of creation week 5. Day 5 and 6 don't have as much there, but we'll see. As I get through them, I might find a few things that, I feel we might need to talk about. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to leave comments on the video. If you know how to contact me, feel free to contact me. I'd love to answer any questions. But let's dive into day 4. So at this point, what do we have? We have the heavens and the earth created. We have a firmament, which would be the sky or the atmosphere. And we have land, and we have plants. And we also have a light source that has, or light with no particular or named source. All we know is on day 1, God separated the light from the darkness. Okay? And it's important again to remember here that Genesis, and the Bible in general, but Genesis is not trying to be a scientific book. Okay? It should be scientifically accurate, but that doesn't mean it's going to go into the particulars of the science. Okay? So when we're talking about the separation of light, we're talking about it from an earthly perspective. Earthly meaning, well, we're talking about the creation of the earth for mankind to dwell in. So what are we not saying about the separation? Well, what we're not saying is that half of the earth was in complete darkness, as in like no light could reach it. And we're not saying that the light had to stop at a certain point. Okay, we're not saying that, God had light on this side and then there's this dividing line through earth where there's zero light that could reach on the other side. Could it be true? Perhaps. But probably not. I mean, this is creation week. God is creating the laws of nature and physics itself. So he could be implementing them and then altering them. But what's more likely is that he just implements them each time he does, and that's it. But again, we're seeing this from the earth's perspective. And again, the idea of this earth perspective will be important again later. And why is it from the earth's perspective? Well, I said this, but just to reiterate, the earth is the habitation that God is creating for man. So earth is the focus here. Other places in creation at this point, don't really matter. And even where they do matter, it only matters in relationship to this habitation God has set up for man. So from the perspective of the earth, on day 1, the earth was separated into light and darkness, day and night, just like today. There's probably some light over here, and it's shooting past the earth, and these light rays are going off into space, and we don't care about them because, again, we're looking at the perspective of the earth. Okay? And that's where we ended on the 3rd day. So let's look at Genesis 1, 14 through 19. This is day 4. And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and seasons, for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heaven to give light on earth, or to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So at this point, beginning of day 4, the only solid matter, the defined matter of the universe was probably Earth itself. There was no planets, definitely no stars, moon, or the sun itself. So this passage states 4 reasons why the sun, moon, stars, and planets were created. They're signs, seasons, days, and years. And your Bible might have a slightly different translation. Again, I'm reading from the English Standard, or the English Standard Version, the ESV. Okay. So if we're looking at these 4 reasons why it was created, signs, seasons, days, and years, if we look at days and years, that's pretty straightforward. Again, the word day here is the same yom that's used other places in this passage, so we're talking about a day. Years, the Hebrew word is shaneh. I think I'm probably not pronouncing that completely right, but it's like shaneh. And it's always translated as a year. When it's not translated as a year, it's with some other words that modify it. Like it'd be talking about, how old are you? When it's really saying, what are the years of your life? But we might translate it as like, how old are you? Things like that. But shaneh really could always really be translated as years in the Hebrew. Now, that brings us to season, or to signs and seasons. Seasons seem straightforward, but the Hebrew word is actually not talking about seasons like we talk about them, spring, summer, fall, and winter. It's talking about appointed times and places. So it's used when we're talking about Old Testament feasts, like you will do the feast at the appointed time. Or for places of meeting, the tabernacle was the appointed place of meeting. So this word is there. It's the tabernacle of meeting is often how it's used. And again, it's talking about that word meeting is like an appointed place. So seasons is less straightforward than it looks at first glance. What about signs? Well, the Hebrew word for signs is used to mark something out as significant. The word sign is used for the mark God gave to Cain. God uses it when he's talking about the rainbow being the sign of his promise not to flood the earth again. Circumcision is a sign to Abraham for the covenant. It's also used for the plagues that God sent to Egypt. Not always directly, but sometimes God says, tomorrow I will send a sign, and it's one of the plagues. Or show this sign to Pharaoh, and then it's one of the plagues. And it's often used with a prophetic statement. Not necessarily for the prophetic statement itself, but usually something that is given as a sign that the future prophetic statement will also come to pass. In Isaiah, I forgot to write down the chapter, Isaiah basically goes to one of the kings and says, ask for a sign from God that these things will come to pass. And that word signs there is the exact same one here. So what does this mean? Well, signs and seasons are most likely matched with the days and years. Now, one of the ways Hebrew works with comparing things, not always, but there's a structure called a chiasm. And what a chiasm means, it's a structure where it's like descending and then ascending in the way it's looking at certain words or comparing phrases. And sometimes what that means is that the inner words would be compared to each other and then the outer words would be compared to each other. And some of these chiasms can be very big in Hebrew, and basically you just The very two end things, the beginning and the end would be lined up, and then the next 200 things, and the next 200 things. And so it could be that seasons are being matched with days. And so the idea is that seasons are things that are, more common than, or at least once a year, but are less common than daily things. And then signs could be things that are less common than a year. Who knows exactly? We don't know. But the idea is probably just marking out special occasions. Days and years are straightforward. Signs and seasons are less straightforward, but still marking out special occasions. So 2 of them would be more specific, 2 of them would be more general. So the sun, moon, stars, and planets are to denote different times for mankind. God could just create day and night, but man wasn't created to be a creature of just 24-hour repeating periods. Weeks, months, years, even longer times are also important to the function of man. So we're not designed to live day to day. God set forth these lights, the sun, moon, stars, planets, to mark our times much longer than a day for us. So that's the purpose of this creation, okay? Another thing about signs that I saw somewhere, it doesn't quite fit with the other words though, but I also saw signs as saying this is a sign of God's majesty. And it could fit, but again, it doesn't really work with the other 3 words. Seasons is definitely certain times, days and years are certain times. But we do know that the stars do show the majesty of God. So we do know that. It doesn't necessarily mean that this word right here is specifically talking about it, though. So that's the purpose. Now, when we look at this, the passage of the sun, moon, and stars, there will be a lot of people that will say that Genesis 4 is just talking about things that were already there. Like the sun, moon, stars were there, but something was obscuring them. Okay, so maybe sunlight was hitting the earth, maybe it was like thick cloud cover, maybe it was something else. You couldn't see what the objects are. It was only on day 4 that they became visible. And it's valid in the sense that's from the perspective of the earth. And again, we need to be looking at Genesis 1 as this is something we're looking at from the perspective of the earth, not the entire universe together. But the problem with this is that if we look at the word made in verse 16, God made the 2 great lights. It's the idea of this that something is fashioned, not something that's revealed, but something that is actually being fashioned. Okay, so it's the same word that's being used for the expanse or firmament on day 2. Okay, so it's a new thing in the sense that it's something being fashioned right now. Okay, it's not something that was there and being revealed. Okay, it might have been fashioned out of existing material, existing matter, that's fine, but we're taking that existing material and reforming it into something brand new on this day. It's also talked about how the plants reproduce on day 3, the same idea of this made. It's the exact same word when it talks about kinds. Verse 11, if you look a few verses back on day 3, I don't know if I said day, I think I might have said day 2. Day 3 was where the plants are. The word yield there is actually this idea of made, of fashioned. So we're saying that the plants take seeds, or the seeds of the plants take existing matter and refashion it into a new plant. So the idea of this made doesn't talk about something that's already made and revealing. So the sun, moon, stars, and planets are new creation on day 4. Now another way I've seen people interpret Genesis, and again we got to think about why are we interpreting this way. Usually again people come to this with this idea of the Big Bang billions of years. But another way I've seen Genesis 1 interpreted is that days 1, 2, and 3 are matched up with days 4, 5, and 6. And so day 1 and 4 actually happen simultaneously. Well, why do they do this? Okay, day 1 and 4 is talking about similar things, celestial bodies. Okay, 2 and 5 are talking about similar things in the water. 3 and 6 are talking about things on land. Okay, that's nice. That's a strange way to put it, but but it still doesn't make sense with the way day works, okay? The way day is used in the passage is a separation from one thing to the next. We're not just looking at, going back and looking at something more specific on day 4 that really happened on day 1. No, day 4 is its own creation, okay? Now, that being said, there is some times in the Bible, in Scripture, and especially in Genesis, where the narrative does go back and look at events that have already happened in more detail. But the specific manner this is introduced hasn't happened yet. It doesn't happen in Genesis 1. Okay, the first time this idea of looking back at stuff that's already created happens in Genesis 2:4. It's always accompanied by this word generations. If you look at Genesis 2:4, it talks about the generations of the, how's it worded? These are the generations of the heaven and the earth when they were created. That word generations denotes, okay, we kind of finished looking at something, now we're going to look back at something specific and talk about that for a while. So that doesn't happen in Genesis 1. So again, there's no indication that day 4 is really just looking back at day 1 and looking at specifics. It doesn't make sense that way. Okay? So and again, I've already said this twice, but third time, repetition is good. We have to think about why we are trying to interpret it this way. Are we trying to match them up to evolution and an old earth? Or are we trying to match up what the scriptures say first? Okay? Now, again, when scientists look back at the past, it is a form of interpretation. Now, some scientists might say the evidence is overwhelming, but still interpretation. We as Christians need to make sure we are looking from a Christian biblical perspective. Okay? We've talked about before already that evolution seems far less likely with what we've discovered about the cell and everything else. And if you want to look at that, you can go back to lesson 2. That's where I talked about it. But we have to make sure we're not bringing in an outside perspective that we want to be true to fit into this, okay? Again, when we do look scientifically, there's a lot of interpretation going on looking at the past. And there's many places out there, Christian places, that have looked at this evidence from a Christian perspective and said, this is how it can meet from a Christian creation perspective. Again, I named a couple of those before. Answers in Genesis is one, creation.com. There's a third one I think I named. I can't remember it off the top of my head, and I don't have it in my notes right now. But there are places out there that actually look at these from a Christian standpoint and say, this is actually what the evidence can mean. So anyways, let's get back to our passage. So sun, moon, stars, and planets were fashioned to mark out time, to give light to the earth. So now, if you watched last week, I gave you guys a little bit of homework. I said, look at the passage and see what words we commonly use to talk about these heavenly bodies that are not found in the passage. Now, if you said the words sun and moon, you're right. The sun and moon are actually never called sun and moon by name. God named day and night. He named the expanse. He named dry land. But when it comes to the sun and moon, he doesn't officially name them here. And the question is, why not? And there's actually a good answer for this. Remember, the Israelites just came out of Egypt. Okay, Genesis is written to them, compiled by Moses with the other books of the law. And the sun and moon were big objects of worship in Egypt and other pagan nations. And God here didn't bother to name the sun and moon because they're not important, okay? Now, you might say two things. One, well, aren't the sun and moon important? We need them for life. Or two, doesn't this wording of the passage make it seem inaccurate? It seems like the passage was tailored to the Hebrews by admitting sun and moon instead of describing what really happened. So let's answer those two questions. First, yes, the sun and moon are important. They're needed for life. But their importance is for mankind. What's more important, the sun and moon or mankind? The answer is mankind. The sun and moon were created as tools to make the earth inhabitable for man. They're less important than mankind, And so we need to appreciate that God has made them very well as tools, but we need to make sure we don't worship them as the bringers of life. It's only God who's the bringer of life. And the strange thing is, this kind of worship of the sun and moon as the bringers of life, I've seen it subtly even in the scientific community. I've seen people talk about the sun being this majestic heavenly body that we should think that it's there to give us life, as if the sun has a sentience and a will. And same with the moon. Moon is bringer of tides. It allows us different seasons. And this view is very subtle at times, but I've heard of people talking about giving thanks to the sun and the moon. Even if you say thanks for the sun and the moon, you ask them who are they being thankful to, and they can't really say, because it's this idea of they're being thankful to inanimate objects. But we know better. We know that they were created for us. Okay? We should be thankful, but we should be thankful to their Creator for His infinite wisdom and His creativity in their design. And for the second objection, that this shows the passage is tailored to the Hebrews to help them give up sun worship, I'll say that just because it happened this way doesn't mean that the passage is less true, less accurate. Okay? What's most likely is that God, since He knew who was going to be writing this down, Moses, He knew who Moses' main audience was, the Israelites. God did it like this on purpose, and purposefully did not name the sun and the moon as an emphasis. So yeah, God, thousands of years before even Moses, did this on purpose, so that when Moses wrote it down, it would be accurate, and also help the Israelites give up their sun and moon worship. You got to remember that God is not limited by time. Okay? He constantly has done things, and some things that we will not understand their purpose for in our lifetimes. And He's done things in the past that their purpose isn't revealed for thousands of years, and perhaps won't fully be realized until He returns again. So this is not impossible for God to have, on the fourth day of creation, had in mind thousands of years in the future when Moses would be writing this down for the Israelites and said, I'm not going to name the sun and the moon. I'm just going to call them their celestial bodies, or the lights, the greater lights and lesser lights. So, yeah. So now this explains the wording of the passage, the sun, the moon. Now, we also got to talk about the big elephant in the room when we talk about this day, which is the stars. And the big question we always ask for the stars is, if the Earth is only 6,000 to 8,000 years old, how do we see the light from these stars? Okay, yeah, there's been 6,000 to 8,000 years for light to get to us, but we see stars much, much further away. I mean, the moon and the sun are easy. The moon is 1.3 light seconds away. The sun is 8 light minutes away. So those would be seen very soon after creation. Even the furthest planet, if you still count Pluto as a planet, at its maximum range is about 7 light hours away. So it'd still get here the same day. But the nearest star is over 4 light years away. So how could God say that He created these stars on day 4 if their light wouldn't reach us until 4 years later? I mean, it says right there in the passage that the stars were created. And again, this is from Earth's perspective, so the light must have hit them on that day. So did God create these stars before creation week? I mean, that doesn't make sense earlier, because it says He fashioned these on day 4. So again, it's a big question. How do we see objects in the sky that are more than 8,000 light years away? Okay, this seems to throw the entire creation story out the window. Okay, so we'd see this and say, oh, creation couldn't actually happen. So did we really just do some weeks of study to get to this obvious point to show that 6-day creation is false? Well, of course not, but let's talk about this. So The first thing I want to say is that, yes, we have what we call a light distance problem. So now with the Big Bang, we can also say it has a light distance problem. Since according to the Big Bang, the universe is only about 13.8 billion years old. However, we have a visible universe that is estimated to be about 46.5 billion years in radius. So how do we get light from these distant spots? Still a problem for the Big Bang. Now, there are some explanations for the Big Bang. They deal with the expansion of time itself, or space-time itself. They deal with the idea of called inflation. And these observations do fit according to the data if you assume that the Big Bang is correct. But they are also needed to explain how the Big Bang could happen. Okay? But again, if these assume the Big Bang is correct to start, and then use that assumption, they provide an answer to explain it. It's again this kind of circular reasoning. It comes to these presuppositions that we have. Okay? But I don't want to talk about the Big Bang cosmology right now. I want to focus on creation cosmology because that's what's important to us. And our problem with the light and light distance problem is a little more interesting. Because instead of saying we have an expanding universe that will let light get here in 13.8 billion years, we have to get light to Earth almost instantly. So how does this work? Well, the answer is actually pretty easily, but only after we've looked at some physics. Okay, and some physics that people don't often think through, so it's going to take some time to get to this. But once you get the physics and know it, it works very easily. Okay, so before I get to this, I want to talk about another model for creation cosmology that can work, and I hear a lot of, but it doesn't seem very satisfying to me. We'll talk about that. But there is a model out there, this idea out there, that when God created the stars, he also created the light between the stars and Earth. So on day 4, not only did God create these stars, but he created the light between them and Earth. And so God could have done it that way, but seems very unsatisfied, because what it means is that any stars beyond 8,000 light years away, we actually haven't seen the light directly from them. Only light that God created on day 4 when God formed them. So again, if we have something that's like 30,000 light years away, all the light we've seen so far is only light that was created already in transit during that 4th day. And for the next, 20,000 years, if God doesn't come back then, which he, probably will, but don't put a limit on God. 20,000 years, we'll still see light that was created on day 4 instead of light from the actual star. And that's not too big of a problem, but the real problem that makes this unsatisfying is it means that there's some stars out there that weren't really created as stars. So what I mean by that is there's stars that are out there that we have seen explode, and again are further out there, and so they wouldn't have. So what would have had to have created, God would have to create the light coming to Earth. He would have had to create the light of an explosion of the star, and then how he actually created the star was already exploded, already no longer a star or a star remnant now, and that doesn't really seem that satisfying. Okay, so. Yeah, the idea of God creating stars that were already destroyed on the 4th day doesn't really fit in with the idea of creation in the first place. God created this universe, is very good, okay? But what can we do about this? Because that's the explanation I hear all the time. So, as I said, there is another explanation, but it's going to take a little bit to walk through. But in the end, we're going to see that this matches up with physics. Okay. So let's talk about light, because we're talking about starlight. So how can we have distance light from stars already, and I'm talking about even further away, millions of years away, already to us if we have this light problem, okay? Now, light itself has a speed limit. Okay, that's our big problem. Light can only travel at about 300,000 kilometers per second. We call that c, the letter c, for the speed of light. C, I think, means constant in this case, but don't need to worry about that. And the 300,000 kilometers a second might seem fast, but it's tiny compared to the distances between stars, which again is why we talk about stars' distance in light years. Okay, so is there any way to get around this speed limit? And that's the crux. And I can't fully explain in one video, but the answer is actually yes, we can get around the speed limit. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to link in this video, I don't normally do this, I'm going to link a video that is a good video on this subject, and I'll try and sum it up here. But a couple things to note, the person who made this video is not a believer. However, he's really good at asking questions and trying to find the answers. And here he's actually talking about the speed limit of light. And one of the things that he's going to talk about in the video, if you watch it, is that we can never actually measure the speed of light traveling in one direction. So I'm going to link it in the description. You don't have to watch it. I'll try and sum up it. But if you think there's details, more details you want to know, I'd recommend watching this video. But let me cover it as well as I can in the time that we have. Okay. So let's talk about, we're going to be talking about the theory of relativity here, okay, which it seems like a lot, and it is pretty big in many ways, but we'll try and break it down. So the theory of relativity actually started with this idea of the measurements about light, okay? What we did to measure light was we took light and we had an object that emitted light, and we bounced it off this mirror far away, and we measured the time it took for the light to hit this mirror and come back. Now, the big observation we got from that was it doesn't matter the speed you're going, you'll get the same relative speed for light no matter what. And it doesn't quite make sense with what we think about things. For example, let's say we're measuring the speed of a car, and we're measuring the relative speed. How fast is the car going relative to me? Now, if we have two observers, let's say myself and someone else, and I'm standing by the road, and I see this car pass, and it's going 60 miles an hour. I say, well, it's going 60 miles an hour relative to me. Let's say we have the other observers in a car going 30 miles an hour, same direction. Well, he's going to say, well, that car is only going 30 miles an hour relative to him. And that's how we normally measure things. We'd say, how fast is it going relative to me? But what we figured out is that two observers, even if they're going different speeds, will get the exact same measurement for the speed of light. And we've done this in so many different ways now, in so many different trials, that, yeah, it's true. And what it means, though, is that as we travel faster, space and time are actually contracting and going slower compared to someone standing still. At slow speeds, the changes is so tiny, but as you get closer to the speed of light, it gets more pronounced. And it actually gets to this point where you can't actually travel faster than the speed of light, because the way physics works, you're never going to actually be able to catch up to light. So anyone who observes light will observe the exact same speed. Again, two people can be measuring the same photon of light, the same beam of light, going different speeds, and their measurement will say relative to them, the light's traveling the exact same speed. Okay, so this 300,000 kilometers per second. Okay, so let's get back to measuring light. Okay, we said you could take a mirror and bounce it off and come back. But let's say you want to measure light traveling in just a single direction. How would you do this? You'd have to have two machines that can keep time, and you'd have to synchronize them together and then move one apart. And this is where it gets interesting, because the act of moving one is changing its speed, okay, relative to the other one, which means that time itself is moving at a different rate for the two machines. So as one's moving, it has a velocity relative to the other one. So their time can get off. They won't be synchronized anymore as they move. So we could have a countdown, we could have a timer, and at a certain time, this one will release the light, and then this one can measure that time to track where it will end. But as it moves, that timer might get off from the other. It will get off based upon relativity. And so moving these apart, we actually can't say that they're synchronized anymore because of relativity. Now, it might not be off by much because we're not moving it far, but based upon the speed light travels, it will be off far enough that we can't consider it a reliable measurement. And there's no way around this. Okay, there's no way to synchronize two things together and then move them apart. And again, if we try and synchronize them as apart, well, what are we going to use to synchronize them? Like beams of light? Well, that's already coming into the problem. How long will it take for those beams of light to travel? And there's no way around this, no way at all. Okay, so what it means according to physics is that you can't actually measure the speed of light in only one direction. You have to have a mirror. So you take an object, you bounce it off, you have a recording device that also can emit light. You bounce it off a mirror and then record how long it takes to come back. We can only measure the round trip speed of light. And this is all actually in Einstein's theory of relativity. And beyond that, there's actually people who have looked at these equations and messed around with them and have shown that even if the speed of light is different in one direction than another, it will still match with the laws of physics as long as the round trip speed of light is what we see today. And again, this is a little complicated. That's why I wanted to link a video if you want to get a little more into this. So, again, the idea is we could have a universe where the speed of light is different in one direction than the other, and it still will work with all of the laws of physics. It will still be indistinguishable from the universe we know today and observe today. You could even have light travel instantly in one direction, and then it would have to go half the speed of light in the other direction, and that would make the round trip still speed of light be c, and it would actually work. So again, this is all in the video. He does a really good job of addressing some of the questions. Okay. Now, you might say, well, this wouldn't really work if we're talking about instant travel of speed of light in one direction, because we're only talking about one side of the sky. If light traveled instantly in this direction, well, then only light from this side of the sky would reach the Earth fast enough. The other half would actually take even longer because we're saying it's moving slower. And that's where the video that I'm going to link will leave off. But there's actually more to describe about how light and relativity can behave. So when Einstein came up with a theory of relativity, and this is true for most physics ideas, he got an equation that had a bunch of variables on both sides. And the idea is to showing how these variables relate to each other. And what that means is that there's multiple ways to rearrange this equation and it all still be true. And we could get meaningful arrangements, different meaningful arrangements from the same equation. So now when we think of relativity, we normally think of speed or velocity, because when we talk about Einstein's theory of relativity, we talk about how fast an object is going from something else. But using velocity was actually only one way Einstein could arrange it. There are other ways. Another way he could have arranged it, and he kind of talked a little bit about this in his paper, or someone else, I don't know if actually he did, now that I think about it, but there's someone who talks about these different arrangements. Another way we could actually arrange relativity equations is using the idea of position itself. So one way to look at is relative speeds to each other. The other way is talking about relative positions. And so in the relative position, it's not the speed that causes the difference of relativity, it's the actual position. Again, it's just one way we could solve Einstein's equations, and it works. A universe that we describe like this would match all the observations we see today exactly. It means that we can use position instead of velocity as our relativistic convention, and it doesn't matter. It both actually work. So what does this mean? Okay. So if position is the key, then not velocity, and light can be instantaneous in one direction, then we could actually define it as instantaneous towards or away a certain point. So if we have Earth, all the light can be defined as instantly traveling towards Earth and traveling away from Earth at half the speed of light. Again, that would mean that the round-trip speed of light is unchanged, but the light emitted from stars on day 4 arrives instantly at Earth. Now, does God have to have done it this way? No. But I think this is actually a very beautiful, simple way that fits with all known laws of physics and matches our observations of the universe. And it's much more satisfying than the idea that there's light still out there from creation day, creation week, that hasn't hit us, and that there's stars that are out there that God created as already exploded, whose light we haven't seen the explosion from yet. But again, that explosion light was created on creation week. So now this is a very interesting idea. It's a really cool idea. Again, this point could be Earth or some point in our solar system where light would travel towards instantly and travel away from at half the speed of light. Again, it doesn't change the laws of physics. It doesn't defy them or deny them. All this is true and possible according to relativity. Now, if we took this to the average scientist and presented it to them, they'd say, oh, that's a nice novel idea, and they'd throw it out. Because this actually places Earth, or our solar system at least, as a special place in the universe. Because that's the special place that light traveled instantly towards on day 4. But we do know that Earth has a special place. After all, again, the Earth is a place where God created for mankind to dwell. Again, this works because creation, Genesis 1, is talking from the perspective of Earth itself. So having a relativistic perspective that is based on the location of Earth works with Scripture. And so our light problem vanishes in an instant, so to speak, completely in line with the laws of physics. Now, again, there might be some objections out there that this is more complicated because we're having light travel differently in both directions. So it'd be simpler just to assume a universe where light travels the same in both directions. And that is a valid point. But again, biblical cosmology of the Earth has the Earth at a special place. God created the sun just far enough away from the Earth to give good enough light to make the Earth habitable. He gave the Earth enough velocity around the sun to maintain an orbit and sustain life. The moon is just the right distance from Earth to create tides without causing too much tectonic stress. The planets, especially Jupiter, are just the right size to deflect most large asteroids and comets coming too near Earth or the inner solar system. We are far enough away from the galactic center to have not too much light and stars near us while still being able to benefit from its beauty. We've got to remember the universe was designed for man. The fact that the Earth is so small compared to the stars just shows God's power and majesty and how He created this universe for us to enjoy and to dwell in. Now, I'm going to end it here. Hopefully we've answered one of the biggest questions about biblical astronomy, biblical cosmology. Now, one thing I do want to add is that we don't have to constantly use this perspective when we talk about science. Part of the idea of relativity is that it doesn't matter what perspective we use, we can use different perspectives to explain things. And as long as we're looking at the sum of the parts as a whole, it doesn't actually change the laws of physics. So just like we use the term sunrise to describe the Earth rotating, where people on Earth will see the sun pass over the horizon of the Earth, so we can also look at the universe from a perspective of galactic cosmology. We don't always have to be limited in using terms from Earth cosmology like Genesis does. So when someone says the speed of light is about 300,000 kilometers a second, we don't have to discuss one-way versus two-way speed of light with them. Only when we're really talking about creation is something that we should try to enlighten people on. But we do know that this is possible according to what we know about physics today. And it could be how God may have created this. Again, he could have done it however he wants. But the first time I heard this explanation, I thought of just such as a beautiful solution to one of the most commonly talked about problems with creation. And so I wanted to share it with you guys today. We don't actually have a light distance problem based upon relativity and what we know about the speed of light. Okay, so that's it for today. Hopefully next week we will be able to finish up Creation Week. I think days 5 and 6 will have some interesting stuff. Again, might not have as much as we have here. But again, who knows? So I will see you guys next week. Bye.